Imagine being completely unbothered by toxic people, not just pretending, but actually feeling zero emotional drain from their drama. In this video, I'm going to show you 13 powerful Stoic techniques that will transform how you handle difficult people. These aren't just feel-good tips. These are battle-tested strategies used by ancient philosophers who dealt with some of the most toxic personalities in history. By the end of this video, you'll have practical tools to maintain your peace of mind, set unshakable boundaries, and turn toxic encounters into opportunities for growth. Let's dive in. Number 1. The mirror technique. Reflect, don't react. When a toxic person launches their verbal assault, imagine their words hitting a mirror instead of piercing your emotional armor. This ancient Stoic technique, practiced by Marcus Aurelius himself, teaches us that other people's actions are merely projections of their inner state. Their criticism, manipulation, and negativity say nothing about you and everything about them. The key is to observe their behavior with detached curiosity, as if watching a nature documentary. Notice how they move from anger to manipulation, from guilt-tripping to playing victim. See these patterns for what they are: manifestations of their own internal struggles, their own unresolved pain, their own limitations. Remember, toxic people are like clouds passing through the sky of your consciousness. They may temporarily block the sun, but they cannot diminish its light. Your worth, your values, your character, these remain unchanged regardless of their attempts to define you. Think of yourself as a scientist studying a fascinating specimen. When they lash out, ask yourself, what wound are they revealing? What fear drives this behavior? This perspective shift transforms their toxic behavior from a personal attack into valuable data about human nature. By adopting this mindset, you create an invisible force field around your emotional well-being. Their words bounce off your mental mirror, returning to their source without leaving a mark on your psyche. You maintain composure not through suppression, but through understanding. This technique requires practice. Start with smaller interactions. Notice how their body language betrays their internal state. Observe how their voice changes when they're trying to manipulate. Document these patterns mentally, building your expertise in human behavior. Each toxic encounter becomes an opportunity to refine your mirror technique. Your responses become more measured, your understanding deeper, your emotional stability more unshakable. You're no longer their emotional punching bag. You're a master observer of human nature. The mirror technique also reveals something profound. Toxic people often hate seeing their own behavior reflected back at them. Your calm observation can be more powerful than any argument or defense. Your silence speaks volumes. Your composure becomes your shield. By mastering this technique, you develop what the Stoics called inner citadel, a fortress of mental clarity that no external force can breach. Your peace becomes impenetrable, not because you become callous, but because you've learned to see reality clearly. This understanding brings freedom. You're no longer compelled to change them, fix them, or prove yourself to them. You simply observe, reflect, and maintain your inner harmony. Their toxicity becomes their burden to bear, not yours to absorb. Through consistent practice, you'll notice a remarkable transformation. What once triggered strong emotional reactions now barely ripples the surface of your consciousness. You've learned to let their toxicity flow around you, like water around a rock in a stream. The mirror technique ultimately teaches us that true power lies not in controlling others, but in mastering our own responses. As Epictetus said, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. By choosing reflection over reaction, you reclaim your emotional sovereignty. Number 2. The empty cup strategy. Release expectations. Imagine holding an empty cup while talking to a toxic person. This powerful Stoic metaphor teaches us to approach difficult interactions without preconceptions or emotional investment. When we empty our cup of expectations, we create space for clarity and wisdom. The empty cup strategy begins with accepting that toxic people will act according to their nature, just as scorpions sting and storms rage. By releasing our expectation that they should behave differently, we free ourselves from the futile cycle of disappointment and frustration. This doesn't mean becoming passive or accepting abuse. Instead, it means approaching each interaction with a clear mind, unburdened by past grievances or future anxieties. Your empty cup becomes a source of strength, allowing you to respond to the present moment rather than react to accumulated resentments. Consider how often our suffering comes not from the toxic behavior itself, but from our expectation that it should be different. We waste emotional energy wishing they would change, wondering why they can't see reason, hoping this time will be different. The empty cup strategy liberates us from this self-imposed torment. By emptying our cup of expectations, we also empty it of the power toxic people hold over us. Their attempts to provoke, manipulate, or control us fall flat when they find no emotional hooks to grab onto. We become like the smooth surface of a lake, ungraspable, yet perfectly reflecting reality. This strategy requires regular practice. Before each interaction with a toxic person, visualize emptying your cup of all preconceptions, judgments, and emotional baggage. Feel the lightness that comes with this release. Notice how much clearer your perception becomes. The empty cup also represents our capacity for learning. Even toxic people can teach us valuable lessons about human nature, boundaries, and our own triggers. When we approach with an empty cup, we remain open to these insights while protecting ourselves from their poison. This mindset shifts us from victim to observer, from reactor to conscious responder. We no longer give toxic people the satisfaction of knowing they've disrupted our peace. Our empty cup becomes both shield and mirror, protecting us while reflecting their behavior back to them. Remember, an empty cup has infinite potential. It can hold anything or nothing. This flexibility becomes your superpower in dealing with toxic people. You're no longer rigid in your responses, trapped by patterns of reaction. You're fluid, adaptable, impossible to manipulate. The empty cup strategy also helps us maintain healthy boundaries. When we're not invested in specific outcomes or carrying emotional baggage, we can more clearly see when to engage and when to walk away. Our decisions become based on wisdom rather than emotional entanglement. As you practice this strategy, you'll notice a profound shift in your interactions. Toxic people lose their power to affect your emotional state. Their drama becomes like weather passing through, acknowledged but not absorbed. Your empty cup remains pristine, regardless of their attempts to fill it with negativity. This approach embodies the Stoic principle of focusing only on what we can control. We can't control toxic behavior, but we can control our cup, keeping it empty of expectations, full of wisdom, and ready for whatever life presents. Number 3, the mountain mindset. Cultivate unshakable stability. Just as a mountain remains unmoved by the winds that blow around it, the mountain mindset teaches us to maintain our stability in the face of toxic behavior. This powerful Stoic technique transforms you into an immovable force of tranquility and strength. When toxic people attempt to destabilize your emotional state, imagine yourself as a massive mountain. Their words, actions, and attempts at manipulation are merely passing weather, storms that may rage around you but cannot alter your fundamental nature. The mountain mindset isn't about becoming cold or unfeeling. Instead, it's about developing such deep roots of self-awareness and inner strength that external forces lose their power to disturb your peace. Like a mountain that hosts both gentle meadows and harsh cliffs, you can remain compassionate while being unmovable. This technique requires developing what the Stoics called philosophical firmness, a state of mind where your values and principles become as solid as bedrock. When toxic people push against these principles, they find themselves pushing against an immovable object. Consider how a mountain doesn't need to prove its strength or defend its existence. It simply is. Similarly, when you adopt the mountain mindset, you no longer feel compelled to justify yourself to toxic people or seek their approval. Your worth becomes as self-evident as a mountain's majesty. The mountain mindset also teaches us about perspective. From the mountain's view, toxic behavior appears small and temporary, like shadows passing over its surface. This higher perspective helps us maintain emotional distance from petty dramas and manipulative tactics. To develop this mindset, start by identifying your core values, the bedrock of your character. These become your foundation, as unmovable as the mountain's base. When toxic people attempt to shake these values, their efforts feel as futile as trying to push over a mountain. Practice this technique by visualizing yourself growing more stable and grounded during toxic encounters. Feel your emotional roots extending deep into the earth, drawing strength from your core values and principles. Let their toxic behavior wash over you like rain on stone. The mountain mindset also brings patience. Mountains are shaped over millions of years. They understand the power of time. Similarly, you learn to take the long view with toxic people, knowing that their influence is temporary while your stability is permanent. This perspective shift reveals an important truth. Toxic people often target those they perceive as movable or manipulatable. When they encounter your mountain-like stability, they typically either adapt their behavior or seek easier targets. Your stability becomes a source of strength for others. Just as mountains provide shelter and support for countless living things, your unshakable presence can inspire and protect those around you who are still learning to deal with toxic behavior. The ultimate power of the mountain mindset lies in its simplicity. You don't need to develop complex strategies or responses to toxic behavior. Like a mountain, you simply need to be fully present in your strength and stability. Number 4. The river method. Flow around obstacles. Imagine being like a river, powerful yet flexible, always finding your way forward regardless of the obstacles toxic people place in your path. The river method teaches us to combine strength with adaptability, transforming how we navigate difficult relationships. Rivers don't stop when they encounter obstacles. They flow around them, over them, or gradually wear them down. Similarly, when toxic people present obstacles, the river method helps us maintain our forward momentum without becoming stuck in confrontation or resistance. This technique embodies the Stoic principle of amor fati, love of fate. Just as a river accepts and works with whatever lies in its path, we learn to accept the reality of toxic people while continuing to move toward our goals. This acceptance becomes a source of power rather than weakness. The river method teaches us about appropriate force. Notice how rivers don't waste energy fighting obstacles they can flow around. Similarly, we learn to recognize when direct confrontation with toxic people is necessary, and when it's more effective to simply flow around their drama. Water demonstrates remarkable patience. It can wear down the hardest rock through persistent, gentle action. When dealing with toxic people, this same patience allows us to maintain our course without exhausting ourselves in futile resistance. Consider how a river maintains its essential nature regardless of what it encounters. It may shape itself around obstacles, but it never loses its fundamental character. This teaches us to remain true to ourselves while adapting our approach to difficult people. The river method also includes understanding timing. Rivers know when to flow gently and when to surge with power. Similarly, we develop wisdom about when to assert ourselves with toxic people and when to take a softer approach. This technique requires developing awareness of your own flow state, your natural rhythm and energy. When toxic people attempt to disrupt this flow, you learn to adjust your course while maintaining your momentum, just as a river finds new channels when blocked. Practice this method by observing how different approaches to toxic behavior affect your energy and progress. Sometimes, like a river, you'll need to carve a new path entirely. Other times, you'll flow around obstacles with such skill that the toxic person hardly notices. The river method brings freedom from rigid responses to toxic behavior. You become adaptable, yet purposeful, powerful, yet peaceful. Your movement forward becomes inevitable, regardless of the obstacles toxic people place in your path. This approach also teaches us about boundaries. Rivers have banks that contain and direct their flow. Similarly, we learn to establish and maintain healthy boundaries that keep us on course while managing toxic interactions. Remember, rivers don't carry their obstacles with them. They leave them behind. This principle helps us avoid accumulating emotional baggage from toxic encounters, maintaining our clarity and momentum. Number 5. The oak tree principle. Deep roots, strong boundaries. Just as an oak tree establishes deep roots and clear boundaries for its survival, the oak tree principle teaches us to develop unshakable personal boundaries when dealing with toxic people. This ancient Stoic technique transforms how we protect our emotional and mental space. Picture an oak tree's root system, complex, deep, and perfectly designed to support its growth, while maintaining firm boundaries with surrounding plants. Your boundaries with toxic people must be equally well developed and maintained, creating a clear space for your own growth and well-being. The oak tree principle operates on the understanding that boundaries aren't walls. They're living, breathing systems that protect while allowing healthy interactions. Like an oak's roots, your boundaries should be firm yet flexible, extensive yet precisely placed. This technique begins with mapping your personal territory, understanding exactly where your responsibilities end and others begin. Just as an oak tree knows exactly how much space it needs for healthy growth, you must become clear about your emotional and psychological needs. Notice how an oak tree doesn't apologize for taking up space or requiring resources for its growth. Similarly, the oak tree principle teaches us to establish and maintain boundaries without guilt or excessive explanation to toxic people. The strength of an oak tree lies not in its ability to fight, but in its robust system of self-protection and resource management. Your boundaries should function the same way, not as weapons against toxic people, but as natural extensions of your self-care system. Implementing this principle requires consistent maintenance. Just as an oak tree constantly adjusts and strengthens its root system, you must regularly assess and reinforce your boundaries with toxic people, ensuring they remain healthy and effective. The oak tree principle also teaches us about appropriate distance. An oak knows exactly how far its roots should extend and maintains this space consistently. Learn to identify the appropriate distance you need from toxic people and maintain it with the same natural authority. This technique includes understanding the difference between flexibility and compromise. An oak tree may bend in strong winds, but its root system remains intact. Similarly, while you can be flexible in your interactions with toxic people, your core boundaries must remain non-negotiable. Practice this principle by regularly checking in with your boundary system. Are toxic people encroaching on your space? Are you maintaining healthy distances? Are your boundaries clear and consistently enforced? Like an oak tree, make boundary maintenance a natural part of your growth process. The oak tree principle brings a profound sense of security. When your boundaries are as well established as an oak's root system, toxic people lose their power to invade your space or drain your resources. Your protection becomes a natural extension of who you are. Remember, oak trees grow slowly but last for centuries. Take the time to establish your boundaries properly, knowing that this investment in your emotional and psychological space will serve you for years to come. Number 6. The lighthouse strategy. Maintain your signal. Imagine yourself as a lighthouse, steady, purposeful, and unmoved by the storms that rage around you. The lighthouse strategy teaches us to maintain our inner clarity and direction, regardless of the turbulent behavior of toxic people. A lighthouse doesn't dim its light during storms or adjust its signal to accommodate passing ships. Similarly, this technique teaches us to maintain our authentic selves, our values, principles, and purpose, even when toxic people attempt to dim our light. The lighthouse strategy operates on the Stoic principle of internal consistency. Your light, your character, values, and integrity remain steady regardless of external circumstances or others' attempts to influence your direction. This approach transforms how we view our role in toxic relationships. Like a lighthouse, we're not responsible for the journey of others. We simply maintain our clear signal. This releases us from the need to manage, fix, or control toxic people's behavior. Consider how a lighthouse functions. It doesn't chase ships or adjust its position to better serve them. It simply maintains its steady presence, allowing vessels to navigate safely around it. This same principle applies to dealing with toxic people. Maintain your position. Let them navigate around you. The strategy requires developing what the Stoics called inner brightness, a clear sense of purpose and direction that remains constant despite external chaos. When toxic people create storms around you, this inner brightness becomes your anchor and guide. Practice this technique by regularly reinforcing your core values and principles. Like a lighthouse keeping its lens clean and mechanism well maintained, Ensure your internal guidance system remains clear and functional, uncontaminated by toxic influences. The lighthouse strategy also teaches us about boundaries. A lighthouse has a specific range and purpose. It doesn't try to illuminate the entire ocean. Similarly, learn to define your sphere of influence and maintain appropriate limits in your interactions with toxic people. This perspective brings remarkable freedom. Just as a lighthouse doesn't take responsibility for ships that ignore its warning, you're not responsible for toxic people who choose to disregard your boundaries or crash against your principles. Implement this strategy by developing consistency in your responses to toxic behavior. Like a lighthouse's steady beam, your reactions should be predictable and principled, not swayed by manipulation or emotional turbulence. The power of the lighthouse strategy lies in its simplicity. You don't need complex tactics or elaborate responses to toxic behavior. Simply maintain your signal, your truth, your values, your boundaries, with unwavering consistency. Remember, lighthouses don't shine for themselves. They shine because that's their nature. Similarly, maintaining your authentic self in the face of toxic behavior isn't about proving anything. It's about being true to who you are. Number 7. The Stonewall Method. Calculated response. Imagine being like a perfectly constructed stone wall, solid, purposeful, and impossible to manipulate. The Stonewall Method teaches us to respond to toxic people with calculated precision rather than emotional reactivity. Just as each stone in a wall serves a specific purpose, this technique helps us choose our responses deliberately. Every word, action, and boundary becomes carefully placed, creating an impenetrable defense against toxic behavior. The Stonewall Method operates on the Stoic principle of economy of action. Like a well-built wall that uses exactly the right stones in exactly the right places, you learn to respond to toxic people with precise, measured actions, rather than wasted emotional energy. This approach transforms how we handle provocations. When toxic people attempt to trigger an emotional response, the Stonewall Method helps us respond with the same calculated precision as a mason placing stones. Each response deliberately chosen and perfectly positioned. Consider how a stone wall maintains its integrity, not through aggression or force, but through perfect positioning and balance. Similarly, this method teaches us to maintain our boundaries through strategic positioning rather than emotional engagement. The technique requires developing what the Stoics called rational response, the ability to choose our reactions based on reason rather than impulse. Like a mason selecting stones, we learn to choose responses that strengthen our position rather than weaken it. Practice this method by evaluating each potential response to toxic behavior. Ask yourself, does this response serve my purpose? Does it maintain my boundaries? Does it reinforce my position? Like a mason testing each stone, ensure every response fits perfectly into your overall strategy. The Stonewall Method also teaches us about persistence. A well-built wall lasts for generations because each stone supports the others. Similarly, your responses to toxic people should create a consistent pattern of boundary setting that becomes stronger over time. This strategy brings remarkable clarity to toxic interactions. Like a stone wall that clearly marks a boundary, your responses become unambiguous signals about what behavior you will and won't accept. Implement this technique by developing a repertoire of calculated responses to common toxic behaviors. Like a mason with different stones for different purposes, have appropriate responses ready for various situations. The power of the Stonewall Method lies in its simplicity and durability. You don't need elaborate strategies or emotional engagement. Like a wall, you simply need to maintain your position with consistent, well-chosen responses. Remember, a stone wall doesn't argue or justify its existence. It simply stands firm. Similarly, this method teaches us to maintain boundaries through presence and positioning, rather than explanation or emotional engagement. Number 8. The Bamboo Philosophy. Flexible strength. The bamboo philosophy teaches us to embody the remarkable properties of bamboo. Incredible flexibility combined with unbreakable strength. This technique transforms how we handle pressure from toxic people. Just as bamboo bends under extreme conditions without breaking, this approach helps us remain flexible in our responses, while maintaining our core strength. We learn to adapt to toxic behavior without compromising our essential nature. The bamboo philosophy operates on the Stoic principle of resilient adaptation. Like bamboo that can bend completely horizontal in a storm yet return to its full height, we develop the ability to weather toxic encounters while maintaining our integrity. This technique begins with understanding the difference between flexibility and weakness. Just as bamboo's ability to bend is actually a sign of its strength, our capacity to adapt to toxic behavior demonstrates resilience rather than vulnerability. Consider how bamboo grows. It establishes deep roots before extending upward. Similarly, this method teaches us to ground ourselves in strong principles while remaining adaptable in our responses to toxic people. The technique requires developing what the Stoics called strategic flexibility, the wisdom to know when to stand firm and when to bend. Like bamboo that moves with the wind rather than against it, we learn to respond to toxic behavior with strategic adaptation rather than rigid resistance. Practice this philosophy by identifying areas where flexibility serves you better than rigidity. When toxic people push against you, experiment with yielding tactically while maintaining your core strength, just as bamboo bends without breaking. The bamboo philosophy also teaches us about recovery. After a storm, bamboo returns to its original position without damage. Similarly, learn to bounce back from toxic encounters without carrying permanent emotional scars. This approach brings sustainable strength to our interactions with toxic people. Instead of exhausting ourselves with constant resistance, we develop the ability to flow with pressure while maintaining our integrity. Implement this technique by developing responses that combine flexibility with strength. Like bamboo that can adapt to various conditions while remaining essentially unchanged, create strategies that allow you to handle toxic behavior without compromising your values. The power of the bamboo philosophy lies in its combination of adaptability and resilience. You don't need to choose between being strong or flexible. Like bamboo, you can be both simultaneously. Remember, bamboo survives because of its flexibility, not in spite of it. Similarly, our ability to adapt to toxic behavior while maintaining our core strength becomes our greatest asset in difficult relationships. Number 9. The diamond principle. Pressure into power. The diamond principle teaches us to transform the pressure from toxic people into personal growth, just as carbon becomes diamond under extreme pressure. This powerful technique turns challenging interactions into opportunities for strengthening our character. Like a diamond forming deep within the earth, this approach requires patience and consistent application of principles. We learn to use the pressure from toxic behavior as a catalyst for developing unbreakable psychological strength. The diamond principle operates on the Stoic concept of adversity as opportunity. Just as the most challenging conditions create the most valuable diamonds, we learn to view toxic encounters as opportunities for developing rare and valuable character traits. This technique begins with recognizing pressure points, the specific ways toxic people attempt to influence or control us. Like the precise conditions needed for diamond formation, we learn to identify exactly what triggers our reactions and use these insights for growth. Consider how diamonds maintain their structure under pressure. Similarly, this principle teaches us to maintain our integrity and values even when toxic people apply maximum pressure to make us compromise. The technique requires developing what the Stoics called pressure resistance, the ability to maintain composure and clarity under intense psychological stress. Like a diamond that becomes stronger under pressure, we learn to strengthen our character through difficult interactions. Practice this principle by consciously reframing toxic encounters as growth opportunities. When faced with difficult behavior, ask yourself, how can this pressure transform me into someone stronger and more resilient? The diamond principle also teaches us about value creation. Just as pressure transforms common carbon into precious diamond, we learn to transform toxic encounters into valuable life lessons and personal growth opportunities. This approach brings remarkable perspective to our interactions with toxic people. Instead of dreading their pressure, we begin to see it as a necessary component of our personal development and character strengthening. Implement this technique by developing specific growth goals related to toxic encounters. Like the precise conditions needed for diamond formation, create clear parameters for how you'll use these challenges to develop specific strengths. The power of the diamond principle lies in its transformative nature. You're not just enduring toxic behavior, you're using it as raw material for creating something valuable within yourself. Remember, diamonds are created through a long-term process of consistent pressure. Similarly, developing unbreakable character through toxic encounters requires patience and persistent application of principles. Number 10. The Solar System Strategy. Maintain your orbit. The solar system strategy teaches us to maintain healthy psychological distance from toxic people, just as planets maintain perfect orbital distances from each other. This technique transforms how we manage space in difficult relationships. Like celestial bodies following their natural orbits, this approach helps us establish and maintain ideal distances from toxic individuals. We learn to resist both the urge to be pulled in too close and the tendency to completely disconnect. The solar system strategy operates on the Stoic principle of natural order. Just as planets maintain their orbits through the perfect balance of forces, we learn to find the optimal balance between engagement and distance with toxic people. This technique begins with understanding gravitational pull, the specific ways toxic people attempt to draw us into their drama or push us away through their behavior. Like planets maintaining their orbits, we learn to resist both attractive and repulsive forces. Consider how celestial bodies maintain their unique paths without interfering with others' orbits. Similarly, this strategy teaches us to maintain our life course while allowing toxic people to follow their own paths without collision or interference. The technique requires developing what the Stoics called orbital awareness, the ability to recognize when we're being pulled too close to toxic behavior or pushed too far into isolation. Like planets maintaining their optimal paths, we learn to correct our course when needed. Practice this strategy by regularly assessing your psychological distance from toxic people. Are you maintaining a healthy orbit, or are you being pulled into their drama? Like a planet adjusting its course, make small corrections to maintain optimal distance. The solar system strategy also teaches us about boundaries in motion. Just as planets' orbits create natural boundaries in space, we learn to establish dynamic boundaries that maintain appropriate distance while allowing necessary interaction. This approach brings systematic order to our relationships with toxic people. Instead of erratic engagement or complete avoidance, we develop consistent patterns of interaction that serve our well-being. Implement this technique by mapping your relationship orbits. Like planets maintaining different distances from the Sun, establish appropriate levels of engagement for different types of toxic relationships in your life. The power of the solar system strategy lies in its natural balance. You don't need to completely cut off toxic people or become overly engaged. Like planets in orbit, you can maintain perfect psychological distance. Remember, planets don't strain to maintain their orbits. They follow natural laws. Similarly, maintaining healthy distance from toxic people should become a natural extension of your self-care system. Number 11. The Sage's Shield. Internal validation. The Sage's Shield represents the Stoic practice of maintaining complete internal validation, rendering external criticism from toxic people powerless. This ancient technique transforms how we process and respond to negative feedback. Like a shield that deflects arrows, this approach helps us deflect toxic criticism by maintaining a strong internal validation system. We learn to evaluate ourselves based on our principles rather than others' opinions. The Sage's Shield operates on the Stoic principle of self-sufficiency. Just as ancient philosophers maintained their peace through internal validation, we learn to derive our sense of worth from our adherence to personal values rather than external approval. This technique begins with establishing clear self-evaluation criteria. Like a sage who judges their actions against philosophical principles, we develop personal standards that remain constant regardless of toxic people's attempts to undermine them. Consider how a shield protects without attacking. Similarly, this principle teaches us to maintain our self-worth without needing to defend, explain, or prove ourselves to toxic individuals. The technique requires developing what the Stoics called inner citadel of validation, a psychological space where our self-worth remains protected from external assault. Like a shield that covers vital areas, we learn to protect our core self-image from toxic influence. Practice this approach by regularly reinforcing your internal validation system. When toxic people attempt to diminish your worth, consciously redirect your focus to your personal standards and values. The sage's shield also teaches us about selective permeability. Like a shield that allows necessary movement while blocking threats, we learn to accept constructive feedback while rejecting toxic criticism. This strategy brings remarkable peace to our interactions with difficult people. Instead of constantly defending against their judgments, we maintain a steady state of self-validation that makes their opinions irrelevant. Implement this technique by developing clear metrics for self-evaluation. Like a sage measuring their progress against philosophical ideals, create concrete ways to assess your growth independently of others' opinions. The power of the sage's shield lies in its completeness. You don't need partial defenses against toxic criticism. Like a full shield, your internal validation system provides complete protection. Remember, a shield's strength comes from its material, not from the force it opposes. Similarly, your internal validation grows stronger through consistent application of principles rather than opposition to toxic people. Number 12. The Phoenix Protocol. Transform through adversity. The Phoenix Protocol teaches us to use toxic encounters as catalysts for personal reinvention, just as the mythical phoenix rises renewed from its ashes. This powerful technique transforms challenging interactions into opportunities for profound personal growth. Like the phoenix's cycle of renewal, this approach helps us view toxic encounters not as destructive experiences, but as initiators of positive transformation. We learn to emerge stronger and wiser from each difficult interaction. The Phoenix Protocol operates on the Stoic principle of active transformation. Just as the phoenix actively participates in its own renewal, we learn to consciously use toxic encounters as opportunities for personal evolution. This technique begins with reframing toxic experiences as transformation triggers. Like the phoenix gathering materials for its rebirth, we collect insights and lessons from difficult interactions to fuel our growth. Consider how the phoenix doesn't avoid its cycle of transformation but embraces it. Similarly, this protocol teaches us to lean into challenging encounters, recognizing them as essential components of our personal development. The technique requires developing what the Stoics called transformative resilience, the ability to consistently turn adversity into advantage. Like the phoenix rising from destruction, we learn to emerge stronger from toxic encounters. Practice this protocol by identifying specific growth opportunities in each toxic interaction. When faced with difficult behavior, ask yourself, what aspect of my character can this situation help me strengthen or renew? The Phoenix Protocol also teaches us about timing. Like the phoenix knowing when to begin its transformation, we learn to recognize when toxic encounters present prime opportunities for personal growth. This approach brings powerful purpose to our interactions with difficult people. Instead of merely enduring toxic behavior, we actively use it as fuel for our personal evolution. Implement this technique by maintaining a transformation mindset. Like the phoenix preparing for renewal, stay ready to convert toxic encounters into growth opportunities. The power of the Phoenix Protocol lies in its active nature. You're not passively suffering through toxic behavior. You're actively using it as a catalyst for personal transformation. Remember, the phoenix doesn't just survive its trials. It uses them to become more magnificent. Similarly, we aim not just to endure toxic encounters, but to use them as stepping stones to greater personal development. Number 13. The Philosopher's Stone. Transmute negativity. The Philosopher's Stone technique, inspired by ancient alchemy, teaches us to transmute toxic negativity into positive personal power. This final strategy transforms how we process and utilize negative energy from difficult interactions. Like the mythical stone that could turn base metals into gold, this approach helps us convert toxic encounters into valuable life experiences. We learn to extract wisdom and strength from even the most challenging interactions. The Philosopher's Stone operates on the Stoic principle of value extraction. Just as alchemists sought to transform common materials into precious ones, we learn to transform toxic experiences into valuable personal resources. This technique begins with recognition of raw material. understanding that every toxic encounter contains potential value waiting to be extracted. Like an alchemist identifying promising base metals, we learn to see the growth potential in difficult situations. Consider how the philosopher's stone was said to perfect any substance it touched. Similarly, this technique teaches us to perfect our character through conscious transformation of toxic experiences into wisdom. The technique requires developing what the Stoics called alchemical mindset, the ability to see and extract value from seemingly negative situations. Like an alchemist at work, we learn to process toxic encounters through a lens of transformation. Practice this method by actively seeking the hidden value in toxic interactions. When faced with difficult behavior, ask yourself, what wisdom can I extract from this experience? What strength can I develop through this challenge? The philosopher's stone technique also teaches us about patience. Like an alchemist carefully refining materials, we learn to take time processing toxic encounters until we've extracted their full value. This approach brings profound meaning to our interactions with difficult people. Instead of viewing toxic behavior as purely negative, we see it as raw material for personal growth. Implement this technique by developing specific transmutation practices, methods for converting different types of toxic behavior into useful personal resources. Like an alchemist with various procedures, have different approaches for different situations. The power of the philosopher's stone lies in its transformative potential. You're not just coping with toxic behavior, you're actively transforming it into something valuable for your personal development. Remember, the true philosopher's stone isn't external. It's our own capacity to transform negativity into wisdom. Each toxic encounter becomes an opportunity to practice this powerful transformation. You now possess 13 powerful Stoic techniques for dealing with toxic people. Remember, these aren't just philosophical concepts, they're practical tools that have stood the test of time. Start implementing them today, and watch as your life transforms. The toxic people won't change, but your response to them will make you invincible. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs these strategies. Until next time, stay stoic.